a sealed envelope, a death too swift, and a silence more cutting than confession. Somewhere between the fog of Baker Street and the firelight of conscience, a truth lay buried, not by earth, but by choice. This is a tale where guilt wears a smile, and justice arrives not with a gavel, but a whisper. Before we begin, I'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from? And what time is it for you right now? Let me know in the comments below. Let's begin the story. It was upon a dismal morning in early November that I found myself once more in our familiar sitting room at Baker Street, watching the soot-streaked fog curl like a shroud against the window panes. The fire smouldered low in the grate, and Holmes had not stirred from his chair in over an hour. He sat with fingertips pressed together beneath his chin, eyes half closed, his lean frame as motionless as a portrait. I had grown accustomed to these silences, but on this occasion I detected an edge of tension behind the stillness, a restlessness not outwardly expressed but no less real. Holmes, when deprived of a case, often became more irritable than idle, and there was, at that moment, a storm gathering behind those grey eyes. "I suppose," I remarked idly, turning the page of the Times, "that peace and quiet are no longer sufficient companions for you." Holmes did not look at me. Instead, his gaze settled upon my shirt cuff. "I observe you took your breakfast at the club this morning, toast with orange marmalade, and I dare say you spilled some in the process." I glanced down, startled to find a faint amber stain just beneath the button. "My dear Watson," he said dryly, "the mind rebels against stagnation. Even a marmalade blot becomes a riddle, if one is sufficiently bored." Before I could frame a reply, likely a defence of my own observational shortcomings, a brisk knock sounded upon our sitting room door. Mrs. Hudson entered with an expression of mingled surprise and caution. "There's a gentleman downstairs," she said. "Refuses to give his name, won't remove his coat, insists on seeing Mr. Holmes at once." Holmes stirred at last. "Curious," he murmured. "Show him up, if you please, Mrs. Hudson, and do take care to note if he favours his left leg." Our visitor entered not 5 moments later, tall, narrow-shouldered, and wrapped in a heavy Inverness cloak that bore the scent of rain and pipe smoke. His hat brim was lowered, shadowing most of his features, but I could discern a firmness to his jaw and a tension to his posture, as though each step were chosen carefully in advance. He paused just inside the doorway, his gloved hands clasped tightly before him. Holmes rose, nodded politely, and gestured toward the hearth. "The fire is yours, sir. The rest, I trust, will follow in time." The man did not sit, nor did he move closer. "Before we speak," he said in a low, cultivated voice, "I must request your assurance, Mr. Holmes, and yours, Doctor, that what I am about to say remains strictly between us. If that cannot be granted, I shall take my leave." Holmes regarded him for only a moment before crossing to the door. He turned the key with a slow, deliberate click. "You have our discretion," he replied. "Though I confess, sir, you intrigue me already. Few men carry that degree of secrecy in their boots alone." Our visitor finally lifted his head, and Holmes's gaze sharpened like a blade. I watched, as I had so many times before, the quiet ballet of analysis begin, the subtle flicker of Holmes' eyes across the man's collar, cuffs, gait, and expression. "You are a man of medicine," Holmes said at last, "recently returned from the continent, and accustomed to wearing your guilt like a second overcoat." The man did not blink. "You have my full attention, Mr. Holmes," he said softly. Holmes gestured toward the armchair. "Then by all means, sir, let us begin." Holmes regarded the man for a long moment before speaking again. "And now, sir, if we are to proceed, I must know whom I have the honour of addressing." The stranger drew a steady breath and removed his hat at last. "My name is Sir Alaric Devane," he said. Even I, no close follower of medical circles, recognised the name. Sir Alaric was not merely a surgeon, he was the surgeon, revered across the continent for operations others dared not attempt. He had been knighted for his innovations in thoracic surgery and had lectured at the Royal College with a precision said to rival any scalpel. Yet the man before us bore little of that reputation's confidence. His eyes were rimmed with fatigue, and his mouth bore a tension that no doubt had etched itself there over sleepless nights. Something had unmoored this man from his craft, and Holmes had already scented its presence. "I have come," Sir Alaric began slowly, "because I have refused to perform an operation." Holmes tilted his head. "Refused, that is hardly cause for scandal." "Not ordinarily, no," the surgeon replied. "But the patient is Lord Selham." Even Holmes's eyebrows rose at the name. Lord Selham was a senior cabinet official, a man whose influence reached deep into both Parliament and finance. "The procedure is scheduled for 2 days hence. A repair of the abdominal wall following a complicated riding accident. Straightforward by all accounts." "And yet?" Holmes prompted. Sir Alaric leaned forward, fingers clasped. "I submitted my withdrawal to the hospital board last evening. I offered no reason. But the truth is, I cannot in good conscience operate on Lord Selham. Not now, not after," he faltered. "After what, Sir Alaric?" I asked. "I would rather not say." "Then why come at all?" Holmes asked, not unkindly. "Because I fear," the surgeon said quietly, "that if I do not seek your counsel, the full truth may never come to light. And a surgeon's silence may yet be mistaken for guilt." Holmes remained silent for a moment, then stood and crossed to the window. The fog outside had thickened. The panes misted over like lungs starved of breath. "You speak as a man who has seen something but dares not name it," he said. Sir Alaric bowed his head. "There are reputations at stake. Not only mine, lives entwined by blood and finance. You must understand, Mr. Holmes, that one false word could destroy more than a career." "And yet," Holmes replied, "your refusal to wield the knife is itself a statement." I could not help but lean forward. "Sir Alaric, forgive me, but surely your reasons cannot be worse than the rumours that will now emerge." The surgeon's face was pale. "There was an incident. A boy, not a fortnight past. He died after what should have been a routine operation. I believe there was more to his case than I was told." "Was the boy connected to Lord Selham?" Holmes asked softly. A pause. Then, "In a way that cannot be spoken in public. That is all I can say." Holmes turned from the window. "Then we must begin our inquiries in private." Holmes resumed his seat with that curious stillness which always accompanied his deepest concentration. His eyes once again passed over Sir Alaric's form, pausing at the left cuff of his shirt where a faint rust-brown smear marred the otherwise immaculate linen. "You were at the hospital this morning," Holmes observed, "and yet you have not operated in 3 days." Sir Alaric followed Holmes's gaze and flushed. No, that is not recent." Holmes smiled faintly. "On the contrary, it is. Judging by the dryness and hue, that blood is less than 12 hours old. Not from a surgical theatre, but from something altogether more hurried. A pinprick, perhaps, or a needle? No, not quite." The surgeon looked away. "You see, Watson," Holmes said, "a physician's hands tell more than his mouth ever will, but the hands too have their secrets." Sir Alaric said nothing. With a brief motion, Holmes stood and rang for tea. When it arrived, he served each of us with deliberate care, but when it came to Sir Alaric's cup, he handed it with his left hand rather than his right. The effect was immediate. The surgeon reached out instinctively with his dominant hand, and the china rattled audibly as he grasped it. A subtle tremor passed through his fingers, just enough to betray itself in the ripple of the liquid. "Ah," Holmes said gently, "you've had little sleep." Sir Alaric said nothing, but his jaw tightened. "No shame in it," Holmes continued. "Fatigue, stress, perhaps even a touch of laudanum in the past few days. But it is not exhaustion alone, is it? That tremor. It would have made surgery an impossibility, even had you wished it. Sir Alaric lowered the cup without drinking. It began the morning the boy died, he said. You must understand, Mr. Holmes, Sir Alaric said at last, that the scalpel is not merely a tool. It is an extension of a man's belief in his own certainty. When that certainty fails, the blade turns inward. Holmes gave a small nod. And you fear that operating now would be not only dangerous, but dishonest. Precisely. Yet you do not believe the boy's death was your fault. I believe, Sir Alaric said carefully, that I was meant to believe it was. At that, Holmes's eyes narrowed slightly. There was something in the dosage, the surgeon went on, or the chart, something I missed, or perhaps something I was never meant to see. But before I could confirm anything, the body was gone, cremated. Holmes's voice was soft. That is unusually swift. Too swift. And now I'm asked to operate on the man who stands at the centre of it all, Lord Selim. If I touch that man with my hand as it now shakes, I may do more harm than good. You must help me, Mr. Holmes, not merely to clear my name, but to protect a patient from my own uncertainty. Holmes stood once more, this time with a curious glint in his eye. That strange brightness I had come to associate with the scent of a case worthy of his powers. You have not told me everything, he said. I cannot. And yet, Holmes continued, you have told me enough. I blinked in surprise. You're taking the case? Holmes nodded. Not for your sake alone, Sir Alaric, but because behind your tremor lies a deeper vibration, the echo of something rotten. Sir Alaric looked visibly relieved. You have my gratitude. Save it, Holmes replied. We shall earn it when we find the truth, and if necessary, cut through it. He turned to me. Watson, fetch your coat. We begin at St. Swithin's. We departed Baker Street that same afternoon beneath a leaden sky. The fog had grown denser still, curling thick along the wheels of our cab as it rattled eastward toward Bloomsbury. Holmes, as was his habit when deep in thought, spoke not a word during the journey, his chin buried in his scarf and his gaze fixed upon the damp blur of passers-by beyond the glass. It was just as we turned onto Woburn Walk that he stirred at last. There is a particular kind of silence that surrounds institutions, Watson, he murmured. Not the silence of peace, but of secrecy. St. Swithin's Royal Hospital emerged before us like a citadel, all grey stone, wide arches and polished brass plaques. A nurse crossed the path ahead, her white cap sharp against the gloom. Observe, Holmes said, how the building exhales order, and how those within it, I suspect, struggle to breathe. Holmes was already known to some of the hospital's higher staff, and we were promptly received by Dr. Challoner, the acting director of surgery. He was a stiff, red-cheeked man who welcomed us with the cautious enthusiasm of one unsure whether Holmes was there to assist or expose. I understand you have questions regarding Sir Alaric's recent withdrawal, he said, folding his hands tightly. Yes, well, rather sudden, wasn't it? A pity, really. Few men could have managed the Selim operation. Holmes raised an eyebrow. Lord Selim is not a man to entrust lightly, then? Challoner coughed. No, indeed. He has a history of benefaction here. Quietly, of course. Funds, land, influence. He sits on our advisory board. Entire wings have his name attached. Ah, Holmes said lightly. Then to lose him, one assumes, would be more than a personal loss. It would be a structural one. Challoner smiled thinly. Hospitals are built as much on names as on bricks, Mr. Holmes. Holmes nodded, almost to himself. Yes, and like many edifices, some names are carved above the door, while others are buried deep in the foundation. While Holmes continued his inquiries in the administrative wing, I took the liberty of wandering the lower corridors of the hospital, where the ordinary staff moved with a briskness born of repetition and fatigue. The orderlies nodded curtly, but it was among the nursing staff that I noticed something peculiar. a stiffness in their manner whenever Sir Alaric's name was mentioned. In one of the break alcoves, I overheard a half-whispered conversation. "I told you, it wasn't the procedure, it was something after," said one voice. "Well, why is he not speaking then?" another replied. "If there's nothing to hide, why act like a man on the gallows?" I turned the corner before they noticed me, but the impression lingered. Something had indeed happened, something which had placed Sir Alaric, once a figure of quiet admiration, under a cloud of uncertain suspicion. When I rejoined Holmes, I noted his expression had darkened. "You observed it too, Watson?" he asked. "The way their mouths closed just as the truth might slip out." I nodded. "As if rehearsed." "Indeed," he said. "But it is not rehearsed speech that interests me. It is rehearsed silence." It was Holmes who singled her out, a junior nurse of perhaps 25, with sharp eyes and the reserved dignity of someone unused to being questioned by gentlemen in fine coats. Holmes, ever gentle with those below the notice of others, addressed her kindly. "You were present during Sir Alaric's final shift?" he asked. "Yes, sir," she said. "He was called to Theatre 4 for Master Wickham." "Giles Wickham?" Holmes echoed. She nodded. "Appendectomy." All seemed routine. But afterward, the child didn't wake properly. By evening, they said he was gone. Did Sir Alaric speak to the family? Only the father came. There were raised voices. The boy's mother had passed last year. The father blamed Sir Alaric. I didn't hear much. Just pain in both their voices. Holmes's eyes lingered on the edge of her cloak. "Curious badge, nurse. From West Dunwich, unless I'm mistaken?" Her eyes widened. "Yes, sir. I trained there before coming to London." "Midwifery?" "Yes." Holmes offered a rare smile. "Then you know the weight of lives before they are counted." She blinked at that, and Holmes thanked her softly. "We must look not only at death," he murmured to me, "but at the birth of motive." We gained access to the surgical records with only mild resistance. As a physician, I could navigate the notations with reasonable fluency. The case of Giles Wickham was recorded in a slim folder, bearing little more than date, time, and basic procedural details. "Appendectomy performed by Sir Alaric Devane," I read aloud. "No complications recorded. Standard ether dose. Death noted 12 hours later. No post-mortem performed." Holmes's brow furrowed. "That, Watson, is not a record. That is an alibi." "What strikes me is the brevity," I said. "No attending nurse notes, no mention of reactions, temperature, pulse, nor any witness to the child's final hours," Holmes added. "And no reason given for the absence of post-mortem." I turned the page and paused. "Ah, cremation order signed by the father, Elias Wickham." Holmes's eyes sharpened. "Elias Wickham? That name rings a sour note." I looked at him. There was a Dr. Elias Wickham once. Struck from the rolls. Surgical negligence, gambling debts. Disappeared from London medical circles 15 years ago. And now reappears as the father of a dead boy, I said quietly. Holmes nodded. "Yes, Watson. And I dare say the boy himself may have been worth more in silence than in life." We were making our way through one of the back corridors near the staff lounge when Holmes raised a finger and brought me to a halt. The polished oaken door before us was ajar by a finger's breadth, and from within came the low murmur of two male voices. "Telling you, it wasn't the surgery," one said. "Alaric's cut was clean. It's what came before that ruined everything." A second voice responded. "You mean the boy?" "No, not the boy as such. Who the boy was. That's the poison in this." A pause. "Well, it's done now. Ashes don't argue." Holmes gave me a sidelong glance, his mouth forming the faintest line of amusement tinged with distaste. When the conversation drifted to murmurs again, he took my arm and led us quietly away. "Ashes don't argue indeed," he muttered. but those who hasten to fire may yet carry smoke upon their sleeves. I was about to press him for meaning when he added, almost to himself, "Not the body, Watson. That was never the threat. It was the lineage, and lineage, as the aristocracy knows too well, can be both asset and accusation." We stood for some time in the hallway just beyond the records room, letting the quiet settle around us like a second coat. Holmes folded his arms and leaned against the stone wall, his gaze flickering across the dark corners of the hospital's interior. "There is a shape forming, Watson," he said. "A pattern, not yet distinct, but discernible in outline, connected to Lord Selham. Intimately, he is not merely a patient, he is the centre around which this orbiting shame revolves. Sir Alaric's refusal is not guilt, it is refusal of guilt, of complicity." I frowned. "And the child?" Holmes turned his eyes toward me. "If I am not mistaken, young Master Wickham was not just another name on a chart. He may have represented something inconvenient, even dangerous, to those who prize legacy over life. Are you suggesting deliberate harm?" "I am suggesting," he said gravely, "that a death certificate may be forged more easily than a birth record expunged, and that some truths are tidied with surgical precision, the kind that leaves no scar, but ensures silence." He pushed off the wall and began walking again. "Come, Watson, we've seen enough, for now." As we approached the hospital's side entrance, Holmes paused by a narrow window looking onto the inner courtyard. There, two men stood in stiff conversation. One of them I recognised as the man from the surgical staff, the other a gaunt figure in clerical dress with ash-grey hair. Holmes watched them without comment for several seconds. The man in the cassock gestured angrily, the other merely folded his arms. When I finally asked, "Do you know them?" Holmes shook his head faintly. "No," he said, "but I know the nature of that posture. One speaks of confession, the other of denial." He adjusted his gloves and turned from the glass. "There's a scar beneath this hospital, Watson. You can feel it in the walls. And whatever the scalpel failed to remove in the operating room, someone has since carved away in haste." I opened my mouth to reply, but Holmes had already stepped into the fog. The report on Giles Wickham arrived at Baker Street that evening, delivered under plain seal and with no accompanying letter. Holmes sliced the packet open with a letter opener, shaped like a scalpel, and scanned its contents with detached focus. I stood by the fireplace, watching his eyes narrow. "Remarkable," he said at last, "in its brevity, if nothing else." I took the document from him and perused it myself. The child's death was attributed to an idiosyncratic reaction to ether, that most convenient of conclusions, for it admitted no blame, yet explained everything. The language was sparse, clinical, and devoid of narrative. No mention of complications, I noted. No temperature chart, no progress notes, no indication of a struggle. "Indeed," Holmes murmured, "and yet we know the boy did not die quietly. You recall the nurse's account, raised voices, a confrontation, but here all is whitewashed in antiseptic phrasing." He tapped the signature at the bottom. "Dr. Elias Wickham." I frowned. He signed off on the death, apparently, and promptly had the body removed for cremation. Holmes folded the paper slowly. "No child dies without leaving a mark, Watson. When there is none, the cover must be deeper than the wound." Despite the lack of formal record, Holmes insisted we pursue the matter further within St. Swithin's own gossip-laden undercurrent, namely the private remarks shared among its senior staff. It was in the lounge of the physician's wing that we caught fragments of guarded conversation as we passed. I tell you, he froze, just stood there, like he knew it was coming, said one voice behind a half-closed door. "And the boy?" "Didn't respond to the gas. Seized before they'd even begun. Alaric couldn't save him, or wouldn't try." "Then why not say so?" A pause. "Because sometimes, old friend, the worst guilt is knowing you didn't see it coming." Holmes led me on, saying nothing, but the crease at the corner of his mouth suggested thought fermenting beneath stillness. "There is always a rumour," he said once we reached the stairwell, "and it always clings to the most obvious suspect. You believe Sir Alaric is being scapegoated?" "I believe," Holmes replied, "that a man who has dedicated his life to the knife would not suddenly fear it, unless he had learned it was used for something it was never meant to do." Holmes and I returned to Baker Street that evening, and by morning he had unearthed a sliver of the past buried in the annals of the medical register. The name Wickham appeared not once, but 3 times, each with a darker ink than the last. "Dr. Elias Wickham," Holmes said, handing me the folder. "Struck from the register in 1879 for malpractice and suspected morphine theft. Accusations were never proven, but his reputation did not survive the inquest." I leafed through yellowing newspaper clippings and brief, scathing summaries. Here, he was briefly associated with the Selim Sanitary Commission. Holmes nodded. That connection interested me most. Lord Selim chaired the commission, a scheme to modernise rural hospitals, which somehow diverted thousands of pounds into private holdings. Wickham, an enabler or a scapegoat, then this was no ordinary patient-surgeon relationship. "No," Holmes said. "This was a man whose return from disgrace would have caused great inconvenience to someone with legacy to protect." He tapped the report once more. "And now we find him again, not as surgeon, but as father to a child whose existence may itself have posed a threat. I fear, Watson, we are entering a game played long before the theatre lights ever rose." Holmes dispatched me the following morning to a modest dispensary off Store Street, where one Mr. Corentyte, registered apothecary, was said to have supplied the ether used in the operation. I found the man pale, jumpy, and with hands that fidgeted ceaselessly with his apron string. I already gave the necessary report," he stammered as I introduced myself. "I'm sure you did," I said evenly, "but I'm not here officially. I only ask, as a fellow man of medicine, was the dosage ordinary?" Tyte's eyes darted. I never saw the vial opened, doctor. I only handed it over, mixed to order. I was told the boy was cremated that very night." "Rather swift," I said. "Too swift," he muttered. "And the family?" "Anglican. The father once denounced cremation as pagan. I remember. I was there." I pressed no further. When I returned to Baker Street and relayed the details, Holmes sat in silence for a long while. An apothecary who fears his own mixture, a father who reverses his beliefs overnight, and a boy rushed to ash before a question could be asked. He rose abruptly. "Come, Watson, the dead are silent, yes, but the speed of their silence speaks volumes." I returned to Corentyte the following day, this time without introduction, without formality, and with the determined tone of a man seeking truth rather than testimony. The apothecary was pale, eyes sunken, and his hands trembled as he rearranged the pestle and jar upon his bench. "You administered the ether?" I asked bluntly. "I measured it." The syringe was delivered with the tray, under whose instruction his gaze flicked away. "The assistant nurse. But you mixed it?" "Yes, though the vial's seal was already broken." I said nothing. I feared implication. "And the post-mortem form?" He swallowed. "Dr. Wickham insisted I sign it. He said it would be cleaner that way." "Cleaner?" I echoed. "For everyone," he whispered. I left him leaning against the cabinet, the weight of some unspoken oath pressing his shoulders downward. When I returned to Baker Street and relayed the exchange, Holmes merely nodded. "Tyte is no villain," he said. "Only a man caught in a theatre of shadows, reading his lines from someone else's script." "And Sir Alaric?" Holmes turned toward the window. "He played no part in the script, and that omission, Watson, is the loudest line of all." That evening, Holmes requested that Sir Alaric return to Baker Street under the pretext of discussing a matter of legal protection. The surgeon arrived promptly, the lines of sleeplessness more deeply etched beneath his eyes. Holmes offered him no pleasantries. Instead, he motioned him to the chair opposite the fire and said, "What you know, Sir Alaric, is not a confession, but a burden. Let us lift it together." The surgeon gave a hollow laugh. "You speak as though I am the criminal. No, you are the witness." And one far too silent. Alaric leaned forward, elbows on knees, fingers intertwined. "There is so much I cannot prove, only what I saw and what I was forbidden to see." Holmes nodded. "You feared guilt where none existed, and thus allowed silence to masquerade as mercy." "I tried to speak," Alaric murmured, "but every corridor in that hospital echoes with names. Names that sit in Parliament, not pews." Holmes folded his hands. "The truth, sir, does not need permission to be spoken." There was a long pause. Then Sir Alaric said quietly, "He was not just a child, Mr. Holmes. He was a symbol, and symbols, when inconvenient, are so easily erased." "I did not kill him," Sir Alaric said, eyes fixed on the coals. "But I stood by as others ensured he would not survive." Holmes tilted his head. "You suspected this from the beginning?" "I suspected something," he admitted. "But the moment I saw the father, or rather, the man calling himself the father, I knew." "Knew what?" "That the child was not his. The boy bore the Selim brow, that unmistakable ridge above the temple. I had seen it in portraits, in newspapers, in Selim himself. But no one else seemed to notice, or dared to." I felt a chill run along my spine. "Then you believe—" "I am certain," Sir Alaric said. "The boy was Lord Selim's illegitimate grandson. The mother was a maid. I remember her, quiet, devout. She vanished from the ward 5 years ago. No one asked why." Holmes's voice was quiet. "A child born of indiscretion, whose existence threatened inheritance, and whose death removed that threat." "But why sign the report?" "Because I was told it would protect the child's honour," Alaric said bitterly. "But in truth, it only protected the living." Holmes stood slowly. "Then the crime lies not in the cut, but in the silence that followed." When Sir Alaric had gone, Holmes and I sat for some time in the stillness of our chambers, the fog pressing like a second curtain against the windows. "I have always found," Holmes began, "that the English gentry are far more skilled in erasure than confession." "You're certain then?" I asked. "The boy was the heir, not in law, but in blood. Yes, the lineage was undeniable and inconvenient. Lord Selim's fortune was destined for his legitimate son. An acknowledged grandson, born out of wedlock, would have brought scandal, division, perhaps even legal challenge. And so," I murmured, "they arranged for him to vanish." "Indeed. The overdose, the cremation, the silence, all arranged under a veil of decency. And Sir Alaric was expected to remain mute, the unwilling guardian of a truth no one wished told." I looked at the glowing end of Holmes's cigarette. "And now? Now we know, but knowledge, Watson, is not always justice. Sometimes it merely illuminates the space between the two." He glanced toward the clock. "But the game is not yet over. There is still the question of who moved the first piece. And the motive?" "Simple," Holmes said. "Bloodline is power, and power defends itself, even from children." It was on a Thursday morning, grey and windless, that Holmes, with the faintest of smiles, handed me a cream-coloured envelope bearing the Selim seal. "You are fond of country air, are you not, Watson?" he asked. "More so when not accompanied by scandal and poison," I replied. "What is this?" "A dinner invitation," Holmes said. "Lord Selim's estate at Wickmere Park. Evidently, our friend Sir Alaric has made overtures toward reconciliation, and Selim wishes to show his civility in kind." I frowned. "And you believe this gesture genuine?" Holmes's eyes gleamed. "No gesture of power is ever purely sentimental, but the timing is exquisite. I have written back to accept. And you intend to dine with a man who may have sanctioned murder?" I intend to dine with a man who believes himself beyond reproach, and to see who at his table reacts when truth is placed beside the bread. I sat down heavily. You mean to confront him? No, Watson. I mean to confront someone, but not directly. He folded the invitation and slipped it into his coat. Polite society often provides the best theatre, and when masks are worn at table, the truth often spills faster than wine. The Selim estate was grand in a way that speaks not of comfort but of endurance. Every panelled wall and hunting print a proclamation of lineage rather than taste. We were received by a liveried butler who led us to a drawing room where guests milled with polite stiffness. Among them stood Sir Alaric, looking thinner than I recalled, and Lord Selim himself, broad-shouldered, silver-haired, and with a mouth set in the permanent line of command. Beside him stood his daughter-in-law, Lady Eleanor, a woman of fine bearing, composed features, and eyes too sharp for her stillness. Holmes, after exchanging the usual courtesies, withdrew a slim folder from his inner pocket and handed it to Salem with an air of casual remark. "Something I found on hospital stationery," he said lightly. "I thought it might interest your lordship. A memorandum concerning ether dosage discrepancies." Salem raised an eyebrow. "You believe this relevant to our dinner?" "I believe it will be," Holmes said. "By dessert." Lady Eleanor's fingers tightened slightly on her wineglass. Holmes turned to her. "You were active in the hospital's fundraising efforts, were you not, madam?" "I merely wrote cheques," she replied with the grace of someone used to lying without blinking. "So did someone," Holmes murmured, "for something more than a wing." As the evening wore on, and supper gave way to the quieter hush of port and parlour chairs, Holmes leaned forward slightly and spoke with what I recognised as feigned idleness, the prelude always to his most deliberate moves. "I've been puzzling," he said, "over a small inconsistency in the records concerning young Giles Wickham." The room grew perceptibly more still. "It seems," he continued, "that the recorded ether dosage was sufficient for a child of 15, which Giles was not. He was 8. That level of anaesthesia could have stilled a grown man's lungs." Selim made a sound somewhere between a cough and a scoff. "Then the apothecary is to blame?" "Curious you say so," Holmes replied evenly. "The apothecary, Mr. Correntite, believes the vial he prepared was never used. Another, identical in appearance, was substituted just prior to surgery. The ledger was altered after the fact." "By whom?" Lady Eleanor asked quietly. "Ah," said Holmes, "that is the question." He reached into his coat once more and produced a facsimile of a medical chart. Fabricated, I knew, but precise in detail. This chart, discovered by accident in the copyist's office, suggests the original ether was discarded and a second source used, not recorded in inventory. See here, 2 signatures in different hands. Sir Alaric, across the room, had gone pale. Holmes leaned back, satisfied. What fascinates me is not what was given to the boy, but who stood to benefit most from his not surviving to speak. "I dare say," Holmes said, "that such discrepancies are common in charitable institutions, but the ledger, Lady Eleanor, that is quite another matter." She held his gaze without flinching. "I don't understand." "Oh, I believe you do," Holmes said pleasantly. "The apothecary's ledger, to be precise, in which there is a curious addition, a supplementary requisition of ether, signed not by Tite, but by an intermediary, a nurse since dismissed." "Surely you're not suggesting I—" "Ordered nothing directly, of course," Holmes interrupted. "But as chairwoman of the Ladies' Auxiliary, you held authority to approve all dispensary expenditures for special needs. And this requisition bore your initials." The silence stretched. "Let us assume, for argument's sake," Holmes went on, "that a woman of your intellect understood the boy's significance. A child not fathered by Elias Wickham, but by a man whose bloodline posed a legal and social risk to your own family." Lady Eleanor's voice was even. "You imply motive without proof." Holmes offered her a slow smile. "The proof lies in your posture, in the way your glass trembled when I mentioned the ether, in the precise timing of the nurse's dismissal, in the fact that you looked not at me, but at Lord Selham," as if awaiting instruction. Selham said nothing. Holmes placed the ledger replica on the table between them. "You wish to preserve legacy," he said. "But in doing so, madam, you corrupted every virtue your family name pretends to uphold." Her hand moved toward the decanter, then paused. It was not guilt that held her still, I thought, but calculation. And in that moment, I understood Holmes's earlier words. Some crimes are committed not with malice, but with deliberation, and from that, there is no repentance. Holmes waited until the room's stillness had settled into discomfort. Then, with the theatrical grace of a man unhurried by consequence, he drew from his coat an envelope, thick and sealed with a crude red wax. "I hesitate to share this," he said, holding it aloft, "for it arrived by private courier only this morning, its sender unnamed. Though the handwriting is unmistakable." He passed the contents to Lord Salem, who read silently, then frowned. "A confession," Holmes explained, "penned, it would seem, by Mr. Correntite." Lady Eleanor paled. "His statement, though brief, carries remarkable weight. He admits to substituting the ether on the morning of the operation. He claims he was urged by a lady of status and paid in coin and silence to correct an error of birth, which would otherwise cast shadow upon inheritance and name." I felt my breath catch. The phrasing was damning in its ambiguity, and yet all the more chilling for its restraint. "Curiously," Holmes went on, "he refers to the boy as not merely a patient, but an inconvenience. He makes no mention of Sir Alaric, only of a benefactor who insisted upon swift cremation and hush money." Lady Eleanor said nothing. Her gaze had drifted toward the hearth, where the embers crackled indifferently. Holmes folded the confession and set it down between the decanter and the ledger. "The dead," he said softly, "speak when the living grow silent." No one answered. It was then I saw it, the barest quiver in Lady Eleanor's gloved hand, not of fear, but of something more fragile. The knowledge, perhaps, that the net had closed, and the letter was its final knot. The silence lengthened. It was Selham who broke it first, with a terse, almost grating, "Is this true, Eleanor?" Lady Eleanor's chin lifted, but her voice, when it came, was scarcely more than a breath. "I did what I must." Selham stared at her, as though he did not quite understand the syllables. "The child," she continued, "was not of Alaric's line. He was the son of your husband's affair with one of the household maids. I only learnt the full truth months before the surgery. Dr. Elias Wickham had been made a scapegoat. The real father, your son, never acknowledged it. Watson, I confess, I felt then the floor shift beneath us all. For while Holmes had hinted, even suggested, the bloodline's irregularity, the matter had never been spoken aloud. Until now. Had Giles lived, she said, he would have posed a claim. And with Selham's health declining, the lawyers already circling, I could not. Her voice broke. I could not permit the family name to be diluted by scandal. "And so you arranged his death?" I asked, my voice thick. Her eyes flashed. "I arranged that a truth already buried should not be exhumed." Holmes did not move. "And the apothecary? I gave him what he needed," she said. "Money, instructions, and the promise that no questions would follow." She turned her face towards Selham, perhaps hoping for justification, but Selham was looking not at her, but at Holmes. It was he who spoke next, not Eleanor. "Is there more?" Holmes tapped the folded letter. "Only that some truths are not buried, merely misplaced, and sometimes," he added, "they return with a courier and a conscience." "I believe," said Holmes gently, "that we have now heard all that was necessary." He rose from his chair and retrieved the letter, With a single fluid motion, he held it over the fire and let it catch flame. The parchment curled and blackened before it struck the hearth. "You burn the confession?" I asked in astonishment. "Of course," he replied. "It was never genuine." A collective murmur rippled through the room. "The letter," Holmes explained, "was written not by Mr. Tite, but by my own hand, carefully disguised. Coran Tite is presently in a safe location under my protection. It was he who provided the names and the ledger. He suspected foul play, but lacked the nerve to name the lady. I merely gave the ghost of his fear a voice." Lady Eleanor rose half a pace, then sat again. "You tricked me," she said. "I revealed you," Holmes corrected. "What you did with deliberation. I merely furnished the occasion for honesty." She said nothing more. Selim sat like a statue of his own name, unblinking and marble-eyed. Holmes turned to me then and offered a faint shrug. "It is astonishing, Watson, how much truth people will confess when they believe someone else has already said it." No one moved for some time. The drawing room had become a gallery of stillness, its polished furniture now nothing more than set pieces in a human tragedy. Sir Alaric, who had sat rigid through the revelations, now rose. His face was bloodless, but his hand steady. He looked first to Selim, who gave no nod, no acknowledgement, only the blank, offended pride of a man who disowns consequence. Then Alaric turned to Holmes. He said nothing. He merely extended his hand, not with flourish, but with gravity. Holmes took it, the gesture as silent as it was powerful. There was comfort, there was mystery. In that moment, no triumph in Holmes's face, only solemn understanding. Sir Alaric inclined his head slightly, a motion more of farewell than thanks, and walked from the room. No one followed. When the door closed behind him, I found myself exhaling, though I had not realized I was holding my breath. Holmes reached again for his coat. "There is nothing more to be said." I glanced back at Lady Eleanor, who sat motionless, the silence of shame resting upon her like frost on glass. Outside, the wind stirred faintly in the trees, and inside, the truth had spoken its final syllable. "Come, Watson," Holmes said. "The country air no longer suits me." We arrived at Baker Street in the velvet hour of twilight, the lamps flickering dimly beyond the fogged windows, and the street sounds muffled into silence. Holmes, upon removing his coat, made immediately for the hearth, where a modest fire awaited, as if prearranged by some unseen hand. "It is curious, Watson," he remarked, settling into his armchair with that peculiar cat-like elegance of his, "how the fog outside seems more forgiving than the fog that dwells within families." I poured us both brandy, more for the comfort of the ritual than the drink itself, and took my customary seat opposite him. "I admit," I began, "I am still unsure how you predicted Lady Eleanor's confession with such certainty." "Prediction is the language of the uninformed," Holmes replied. "I merely followed the natural curve of guilt." He paused and sipped. "Now, before the smoke fades and your curiosity drives you to interrogate me with all the vigour of a Scotland Yard man denied tea, shall we untangle the final threads?" I leaned forward eagerly. "Please do." Holmes nodded, eyes glinting with thought. "There are cases," he said, "in which the truth is not so much hidden as it is silently agreed upon. This, Watson, was one of them. But among such silences, one voice must eventually ring louder. In this instance, it was not mine, nor even Sir Alaric's." He leaned back, the firelight catching the precise line of his profile. It was the voice of conscience, long suppressed, but never entirely extinguished. "You suspected Sir Alaric from the start?" I asked. "On the contrary," Holmes replied. "I suspected he had already condemned himself far more harshly than the law ever could." He folded his hands together, fingertips steepled beneath his chin. "You recall his refusal to explain the failed surgery? That was not cowardice, Watson. It was his form of protest. In his mind, he had been a silent instrument in a performance whose music he did not compose. But he signed the post-mortem report. Yes, because the evidence had been destroyed. cremated beyond retrieval. What could he write? A vague suspicion. He knew the tampering had occurred. He sensed it. But he lacked the authority to accuse and the will to ignite scandal. I reflected on the man's haunted eyes, the tension that never seemed to leave his shoulders. He believed, Holmes continued, that remaining silent was the least harmful course. But silence is rarely neutral. In this case, it became a tacit blessing for a quiet act of murder. And you drew him out. I gave him something rarer than confession, Watson. Vindication. When Lady Eleanor crumbled, he saw in her words the proof he had long feared, and in mine, the absolution he could never ask for. Holmes rose and crossed to the mantel. It is a peculiar thing, the burden of the just man who remains quiet. It is not that he cannot speak, but that he believes no one would listen if he did. You mentioned the boy's blood on Sir Alaric's cuff, I said, but surely that could be explained by the procedure itself. Precisely, said Holmes, which is why it was so devilishly revealing. I frowned. I don't follow. Holmes resumed his seat, one brow lifted in that maddening way of his. Recall the stain, not at the wrist or palm, but at the very edge of the cuff, faint, as though pressed accidentally. Yes, I remember. Now consider, Sir Alaric claimed to have only prepared the instruments and overseen the anaesthesia. He denied placing the mask himself. That task fell to the apothecary. And yet the blood suggested a hand too near a mouthpiece, too involved for a bystander. It was guilt, Watson, not in deed, but in nearness. He had tried to intervene. The tremor in his hand confirmed it. The tremor? You noticed it too, surely. At the manor, he attempted to pour tea and spilled a single drop on the saucer, not the gesture of a man at ease. That tremor was not medical, it was moral. I sat back, stunned by the elegance of it. You see, Watson, in some crimes, the perpetrator leaves fingerprints. In others, the bystander leaves footprints in conscience. Sir Alaric's every subtle action bore the mark of someone who knew and regretted, yet chose silence over war. Holmes added after a pause. The blood was never on his hands, but it was always near them. The haste of the cremation, Holmes continued, was perhaps the clearest alarm bell of all. I did find that odd, I admitted. The boy's body was burned within 24 hours, was it not? Indeed, an action Lady Eleanor attributed to grief and delicacy, but grief does not fear scrutiny. Only guilt does. He reached for his violin and touched it absently. A post-mortem might have revealed the altered compound in the lungs. Traces, yes, but enough for an observant analyst. By hastening the cremation, she ensured there could be no second opinion. And yet, I said, she spoke so often of honour, of preserving the family dignity. A common mask, Holmes said. What she truly sought to preserve was the inheritance. Had the truth of Giles Wickham's lineage emerged, had it been confirmed through any legal instrument, the estate might have passed in wholly unexpected directions. Even if the boy was illegitimate, there are precedents, Holmes said, and more importantly, there would have been scandal, a shadow upon the family name, and questions asked that could not be answered without shame. So she erased the evidence. She burned it, Holmes said simply. Flesh, blood, and legacy, all reduced to ashes under the guise of mourning. He let the violin bow rest gently upon the strings. And yet, he said, you may destroy a body, Watson, but guilt, once exposed to air, rarely dies quietly. She was no fool, Holmes began after a measured pause. Lady Eleanor was proud, calculating, and possessed of a maternal instinct honed by fear rather than affection. She feared the scandal? I asked. Not merely scandal, said Holmes. She feared disinheritance, not for herself, but for her son. The boy Giles Wickham was her husband's nephew, born, I believe, of a liaison abroad some 20 years past. The elder Wickham, being childless, expressed sudden fondness for the youth, and intended to amend the will accordingly. That, Watson, was the true spark of dread in Lady Eleanor's breast, and so she acted, precisely, when illness befell the boy, a minor ailment by all accounts. She seized her moment. With the help of the apothecary, who was not beyond persuasion when Silver crossed the table, the sedative dosage was altered just enough to tilt sleep into death. It was artfully done. No violence, no visible cause, only the silence of a failed recovery. But why not involve Sir Alaric in the deception? Holmes shook his head. She knew him too well. His honour may have bent under pressure but not broken, so she let him perform the final steps, and thus carry the suspicion. A surgeon's failure would draw less scrutiny than a noblewoman's intervention. I felt a slow chill rise. She killed the boy to preserve her son's future. She killed a threat to a name, Holmes replied. Inheritance, not by blood, but by design. That is the tragedy, he added, almost to himself. And she left Sir Alaric to bear the stain, knowing he would speak no word that might unravel a reputation. And the letter? I asked. The so-called confession from Confrontation. Holmes permitted himself the faintest smile. Fabricated, every syllable. I nearly dropped my glass. You forged it. With some care, Holmes said. It bore the man's handwriting, replicated from chemist's notes he left in a discarded prescription book. The phrasing I borrowed from a confession I once studied in a separate case, adjusted to suit our narrative. But why? To mislead? To provoke, said Holmes. Lady Eleanor, though strong, was under strain. The mere mention of a confession that someone, somewhere, had preserved evidence was enough to tilt her composure. It was not a trap to ensnare the law, Watson. It was a mirror held up to her guilt. I was silent a moment. And Confrontation? In hiding, quite safe, though less voluntarily than he might wish. He fled when I confronted him, but I anticipated his route and ensured his accidental discovery by a certain fishing constable I have dealings with in Kent. So the apothecary lives. For now, whether he remains out of reach of retribution is another matter. I have arranged his passage to Canada under a pseudonym, a small mercy in exchange for an even smaller courage. Holmes leaned back. The confession was false, but its effect genuine. Lady Eleanor confessed to a crime she believed uncovered, not because the letter named her, but because her conscience did. I could contain myself no longer. Then she walks free, after all this? Holmes looked at me with a curious calm. Justice, my dear Watson, does not always wear robes nor carry scales. Sometimes it merely waits. But she confessed. To us, he said. Not to the police, and even if she had, do you imagine the Crown would press charges against the wife of a peer based on hearsay and an anonymous note? I frowned. Then the whole effort was in vain. Not so. Sir Alaric has peace. The apothecary is removed, and Lady Eleanor must live with the knowledge that her secret breathes outside her control. He added more softly, there is a justice in that. It seems a poor substitute, I muttered. Holmes stood and refilled his glass. Society guards its higher walls with thicker curtains, Watson. In such homes, shame is feared more than sentence. I looked into the fire, uncertain. But what of the boy, Giles Wickham? Holmes raised his glass slightly. His name has been silenced, but not erased. You and I will remember it. And sometimes, Watson, remembrance is the only verdict the world can offer. He took a sip and added, the law may sleep, but truth does not. It waits in ledgers, in letters, in the tremble of a surgeon's hand. And eventually, someone listens. I said nothing further. I had no words that could reach the strange corner of Holmes' mind where logic and justice so often passed without shaking hands. The fire had dwindled to a low orange glow, casting elongated shadows upon the carpet. Holmes sat motionless, his gaze not upon me, but somewhere distant, adrift in thought. "Conscience," he murmured, "is the most patient of all witnesses. It neither presses nor forgets." I stirred in my chair. "And yet it has no voice, unless summoned." Holmes looked over at me then, his expression unreadable. "Ah, but it does speak, Watson, in refusals, in hesitations, in silence. A man may say nothing, and yet shout with what he declines to do. Sir Alaric spoke louder in his abstention than most do in confession." He stood, stretched his lean frame, and reached for the violin resting nearby. "As for Lady Eleanor," he said, tuning a single string, "she will find no peace in the quiet halls of Selham, not now." And as the first solemn note rose from the strings, trembling like a distant bell through the fog, I found myself wondering not about the crime, but about the cost. A cost paid not in prison walls, but in sleepless nights. The following morning dawned with a peculiar stillness, save for the occasional hiss of passing wheels lost in the thick, grey fog that clung to Baker Street like a living shroud. Holmes and I sat in our familiar chairs, each absorbed in thought, the silence between us not of awkwardness, but of resolution. Outside, London stirred with its usual unconscious dignity, the bells of St. Mary's tolling the hour like a metronome marking time for secrets yet to be uncovered. The fog swirled softly against the window panes, momentarily concealing the world beyond, as if the city itself hesitated to resume its usual rhythm. Holmes was motionless, his long fingers steepled, eyes half-lidded in repose. There was a peculiar serenity in his posture, as though the case, grim and tangled as it had been, had settled some private balance within him. I dared not break the hush. It seemed as sacred as a closing prayer. At length, Holmes stirred, his voice low and without triumph. "There are some instruments, Watson, which cut not by steel but by restraint. Sir Alaric was such a blade." I glanced toward him, unsure whether he spoke metaphorically or in mourning. "He could have saved himself," Holmes continued. "A letter, a declaration, even a whisper to the coroner would have redirected blame. But he refused. Not out of cowardice, as many thought, but to avoid adding weight to a grief already unbearable." "You think him noble?" Holmes tilted his head slightly. "I think him precise. His abstention was not weakness, but the only incision he could bear to make. He cut away scandal with silence." There was admiration in Holmes' voice, rare and never carelessly spent. "A man who chose not to operate," I murmured, "and thereby performed his final surgery." Holmes gave a slow nod, one that left no scar but on himself. Though soothed by resolution, a nettle of discomfort had lodged itself within me since the confession, or rather the false confession, was revealed. "There's something that troubles me, Holmes," I said finally. He did not turn, but I saw the faint tightening of his jaw. "You deceived her," I said. "You crafted a forgery, baited her with a lie, and led her into a trap not of law, but of conscience. I cannot help but wonder if such ends justify such means." Holmes exhaled, as if weary of the eternal tug-of-war between deduction and ethics. "You told me once," I added, "that truth is a blade, but even a surgeon must know when to cut." Holmes looked toward the window now, where the fog had begun to lift. "You speak of wounds, Watson. I speak of infections." "And do you call guilt an infection?" He paused. "Only when it festers behind silence." Holmes turned his gaze fully upon me now, his eyes distant yet unblinking. "There are truths, my dear Watson," he said, "which, if delivered without care, do more damage than the falsehoods they replace. I chose my tool carefully, and it was not the hammer of law, but the scalpel of suggestion." "You speak as though deceit were a virtue," I replied. "No," he said calmly. "I speak as one who has watched justice stumble, gagged by etiquette and lineage. When truth cannot be summoned by fact, it must sometimes be awakened by fear. I could find no immediate answer to this, and so I remained silent. Holmes leaned back. A surgeon may lie to his patient to save their life. I lied to a killer to reveal a death. The principle, I think, is not so distant. He closed his eyes briefly. Truth is a scalpel too. You need only choose where to cut. There was a light knock, followed by Mrs. Hudson's usual shuffle. She entered, tray in hand, bearing a single envelope sealed with a curious crest, a golden sunburst on deep green wax. Holmes took it, examined the seal with interest, and slit it open with his penknife. As he read, his expression, so often austere, lifted at the corners with a faint but unmistakable smile. "Pack your bag, Watson," he said, folding the letter with care. "A case!" He stood, already reaching for his coat. Of course, but not just any case, one with a shadow longer than Selim itself. As the carriage wheels faded into the distance and the lamplight flickered low against the misted panes, Holmes stood by the hearth, fingers steepled, eyes half closed in thought. A curious business, I ventured, still uneasy. Justice was not done in court. And yet something deeper was set right, wasn't it? Holmes gave a faint, sardonic smile. There are verdicts, Watson, that no judge may pronounce, but the conscience, when properly summoned, never fails to deliver. Sir Alaric never spoke a word, and yet his silence condemned louder than any accusation. He turned then, drawing his violin from the shelf. "The question isn't who acted," he added softly, tuning a low string, "but who refrained, and why? What do you think was the criminal's greatest mistake? The act itself, or the hope it would remain buried forever? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this tale of deception, silence, and justice without trial, don't forget to subscribe for more Sherlock Holmes mysteries. Share this story with friends who love a good deduction. The game's never truly over. Let's see who solves the next one first.